We're ready to get started. Welcome everybody to the first of four of our Future of Transportation webinars. This one focused on trucking. We've got some excellent panelists lined up for what is going to be a very exciting discussion this afternoon. But before we introduce our guests and get into our discussion, I wanted to first turn it over to our President and CEO, Perrin Beatty, for a few remarks. Perrin?
Well, Ryan, thank you very much. Let me echo you. Welcome everybody to the first iteration of our four-part Future of Transportation webinar series. If yesterday's preparatory call is any indication, we're in for a really interesting discussion. We're pleased to be joined today by leading representatives from Canada's trucking industry. Sean Gerard, who's the CEO of Energy Transport, Stephen Lefkowski, who's the president of the Canadian Trucking Alliance, and Bruce Bowser, who's the chairman and CEO of AMJ Campbell, as well as our venerable Senior Director of Transportation and Infrastructure Policy, whom you've already met, Ryan Greer. It's safe to say that Canada's economy could not function without truckers. Over 70% of Canada's goods are transported through this mode. Now, pre the pandemic, the industry employed about 302,000 Canadians and contributed about $65 billion to our GDP. Now, notwithstanding this high economic output, trucking companies have faced tremendous challenges both before the pandemic and during, but they've equally demonstrated resilience in the face of challenges as they work to keep our supply chains flowing and operational. They really are, in many ways, the unsung heroes of this pandemic, without whom the Canadian economy was simply have ground to a halt. Now, this conversation will revolve around how the industry has addressed the challenges, what steps it's taking to mitigate their impacts, and what Canada can do to help to avoid them in the future. On behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and its members, I want to thank the industry for its hard work and its tenacity in the face of an enormous and unprecedented economic challenge. With that, I'll turn it over to Ryan to moderate the panel and any questions you may have for our outstanding guests today. Ryan, back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Perrin. Just one housekeeping note for questions. I've got a few questions that I'd like to ask our panelists. And then as we progress to the answer, we've got some time for audience questions. You can ask those through the Slido app. If you're joining us through Lifesize, you can see the address and the event code where you can ask your questions. Once you're in the app, you can also upvote questions from others that you'd like to hear, and I'll try to start at the top of that list as we run through them. Again, a reminder to please keep your lines muted if you're not speaking, and I'm really looking forward to this. And maybe I'll sort of start by echoing something that Perrin said, which is, calling trucking an essential service, especially over the last several months, almost seems like a bit of an understatement given the role that they've played, not only keeping our supply chains moving, but keeping our store shelves stocked at a time when things seemed a little dicey in the early months of the pandemic, and Canadians rushed out to buy and fill up on the products that they needed. So, I really want to start with a pretty broad question to each of our attendees. Maybe each of you first just to tell us just a little bit about yourself and your company, your organization, and then sort of from there, just maybe tell us a little bit about how you've adapted your business or your members' businesses, in your case, Steve, in the challenging operating environment that you faced over the past several months that's been brought on by the pandemic. So why don't we start with you, Bruce? Let's turn it over to you, President and CEO of AMJ Campbell, to give us a little download on AMJ and some of what you guys have been up to the last several months.
Great, Ed. Thank you for the invite. Perrin, it was good talking to you yesterday, and thanks for the introduction and to the fellow panelists. I've been, Bruce Bowser, I've been President and CEO of AMJ Campbell for 28 years, and last year passed the reins over. We have a new president, actually, so I'm still chairman of the board and quite involved in the business, but not in the day-to-day role, just for some clarification in case the new president is watching this. Anyway, how did we, when the pandemic first, sort of hit, Canada, I think a lot of us were led to believe through press or whatever that it might be short-lived, that, this could be a short pandemic, and, not to call out, any of the brutal leaders south of the border that were talking about the fact that it would be done within 30 days and we'd be back to normal. I think a lot of us, weren't prepared. And then, we hoped that that this would end quickly. And, as most of us entrepreneurs know, hope is not a strategy or a plan. And we quickly realized as a company, after a couple of weeks that the pandemic was probably going to be around for a lot longer than 30 or 60 days. So, we did a couple of things. One, we began communicating very quickly with our group. So we would have, initially 2 times a week, we'd have calls with our entire group. We've got 60 some locations across Canada, and try to, we had a committee, a steering committee of the COVID response team that would try to collect as much information as we could on a daily basis from press, because, in the early days, communication was, you're getting a lot of it from the press or from the Prime Minister's daily briefings. And we try to communicate that down to our offices. We also, looked at early on, ways we could pivot our business if things started to change quickly. So we're largely in the moving and transportation business, and that's what we're known for. But we also do a lot of other modes of transportation, a lot of final mile work. And so, within the first 2 to 3 weeks, we had a couple of people that were just looking for opportunities. So we began doing, a lot of deliveries for product that we would not normally deliver. We were doing work for hospitals. We did a lot of work for food banks across the country, which, a lot of that was, done without pay, but it was also a feel-good thing for our group, and it was something that the community needed. And then, a huge thing that we talked about, yesterday in our pre-call was we looked for ways to pivot, knowing that the moving business was probably going to slow down the longer the pandemic continued. And we got into, we have been in it, but we got into doing more home deliveries. So we do home deliveries for, a lot of the largest furniture companies in North America, large products, not Amazon packages, but large products. And, so between communicating and pivoting and, trying to get as much information as we possibly could, we kind of turned hope into more of a plan and a strategy.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Bruce. Why don't we turn it over to you, Sean, and tell us a little bit about your experience in the Energy Transportation Group over the last several months.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. First off, do you hear an echo? Good. Okay. So first off, we at Energy approached similarly to how Bruce approached it. Is we started communicating almost immediately. We were very fortunate that we were set up for. I think we were planning more for the end of the world rather than a pandemic. So we were sort of set up with the generators. Everybody had laptops, extra screens, etc. So we were pretty quick at pick up and go. Our staff, general age of our staff is what played the biggest part in this, is because a lot of our staff have children like myself. So I quickly understood that the need to be able to take care of the family with 2-income families, a lot of 2-income families today. We quickly realized that we would have to work from home. So we were work from home in about, I'd say 24 to 48 hours. We were complete work from home. So that took off and went really well. On the equipment side, on the driver's side, we were dealing with the borders. That was a little more difficult. We had, 80% of our trucking business is cross-border business. So we needed to act quickly in, getting the drivers protected, the sanitizers, making them feel comfortable, giving them all the information that they required, getting them comfortable to actually leave home and come back. That was very difficult. We had a lot of drivers that, chose for the first month to just remain in their truck, whether it be in our yard or truck stops, et cetera, not to come home. So that was a huge challenge. On the, we have 5 offices, so headquarters in Montreal, we got 2 in Toronto, headquarters for the United States is in Chicago, and then we got a new office in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So that was all great here in Canada, but south of the border, they weren't as quick to act, and our employees didn't want to go home. They didn't want to work from home. We thought it was the best and safest thing to do for everyone. Eventually, about a month after, requesting that our Chicago office did go home. Actually, Chicago's in really bad shape right now with riots, the pandemic, etc. So they are scattered across the country. We employ a lot of students in Chicago, so a lot of them have chosen to move back home with their parents wherever they come from. But all that to say, working from home for us has gone extremely well. I think the disruption to trucking overall, we weren't immune to it, but it just proves that our industry is I tend to say sometimes it's scrappy but resourceful, and we definitely figured it out. Trucking has made it through environmental and economic disasters in the past, and I think truckers will continue to do so.
Thanks so much, Sean. And then lastly, but of course not leastly, Stephen Lakowski, President of the Ontario Trucking Association and the Canadian Trucking Alliance. What's been your view from the association and through your members on sort of what they've been through and how things have gone the last several months?
Hello? Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, perfect, thanks. So, I think the other presenters just brought up the table. I think primary role of the Canadian Trucking Alliance, and for those who don't know what the Alliance is, as its name suggests, we are an alliance of the 7 provincial trucking associations. So when COVID-19 hit, our central role as an organization was to act as the centralized communication point. So we had daily calls with our executive, which consists of carriers and associations from across the country for a period of 8 weeks. The one thing about transportation is that it touches all different types of regulators, including health, which quite frankly, we normally wouldn't deal with a lot. So you have CBSA, you have health, you have transport, you have provincial ministries, provincial regulators of health. And so the job of the Alliance throughout this crisis was to piece information together from all these different levels of government. And quite frankly, at times you would find different levels of government, different departments within departments, because of the crisis, having challenges dealing with what are the issues of the day and what are the solutions. So we've gone through an unprecedented time of, the classic example of the border being closed. I mean, borders don't close. They've only closed in my time in 25 years when 9/11 came, and that was for a very short period. And so, we don't talk about it a lot, but that was a really tricky time of communicating. Yeah, the border never closed for trucking, but misinformation, enforcement information, how it's to function. So the long and the short of it is, I think the key to the association's success was communication, working with governments and understanding that governments are doing their best, but it was such a, as we all hear these days, fluid situation, that the reality and the facts of Wednesday may be very different by Friday.
Thanks, Steve. So just another note before my sort of next question is a reminder that anybody listening can ask a question through the Slido app, or you can vote on questions that have already been asked. I'm starting to take a look at that list, and we'll get to a few of those here in just a few minutes. Let's spend a little more time on the border, given that everybody's sort of brought it up in their first answer. As you said, Steve, we're talking about a very, very fluid situation early on in the pandemic. Some of the problems and challenges have been ironed out. Some of the processes have become a little more standard. But I think, as we've all seen with some of the recent COVID numbers in different parts of the country that is in place, we're all living with this for, this fall, the winter, and at some point into next year. So I guess I'd like to hear from either each of you or whoever wants to take a shot at this on, what do you think, or what do you see, or what do you need to hear from governments to keep the border not only remaining passable, but to, improve whatever you need to make sure that your trucks and your drivers are getting across efficiently, and that that we're not sort of having to continue to make it up as we go along. What do you need, whether it's through testing or other mechanisms to keep the border moving efficiently over the coming months? We turn back to you, Bruce, and then I'll ask Sean or Steve to weigh in if they'd like afterwards.
I think you touched on it, right away when you say testing. For us, not just for the for the transportation business, but in general, I'm a huge proponent of the fact that when the pandemic first started, a lot of the decisions were being made in conjunction with politicians and scientists and doctors talking, which I think was the right thing to do. So, for the first 90 days, I think it was, it was reacting, putting safety measures in place. I guess if I have a criticism, and I'm not huge on criticizing, I call it a suggestion, and I've tried to get this through to all levels of government. I think it's time now for government, healthcare, and business leaders to start communicating about better ways to manage this, because we're going to be in it for a while. And so, for me, rapid testing is something that needs to happen, not just at the borders, but in our business in general. So, I'll give an example. At our own operation, one of our offices last week, with back to school, one of the kids, children of an employee tested positive, and we now have a small department, but it's a very important department with 7 people in it who are around the parent of the child that tested positive. A bunch of things happen. One, if you call Health Canada, you can get 2 or 3 different opinions on what you're supposed to do. So there is, there's a lack of clarity on what the process should be. But in this case, we basically had to send everybody home and shut down, one of the most important, dispatch departments that we have until we got everybody tested. Again, not to take shots at our healthcare system, but it can take, hours now with these lineups, especially in places like Ottawa. The lineups are atrocious. And then it can take 2 to 4 days to get your results back. And, if we're deemed an essential service, we can't be shut down for 4 or 5 days and stay in business for very long. And I think with the flu and the cold season coming, now we're going to have employees that, that have a cough, a sneeze, a runny nose, and everybody, it's like the plague, right? Unfortunately, one of the, the sad parts of this is that, when you go anywhere and you cough, sneeze, people, they're like, whoa, get away. And so I think employees are rightly anxious and concerned about it. And to me, the only way we're going to be able to deal with that quickly is to have rapid testing. So, in the U.S., I know their numbers are higher than ours, and they have, they have not responded as strongly as we have in some cases. But right now, they do have rapid 15-minute tests that are available. And I shared, I purchased some of them, for myself, and we can't use them broadly in our country yet because they're not approved by Health Canada, but they're approved by FDA. When I talk to Health Canada, there's 83 of these fast rapid test kits that are on their list of kits being reviewed, but they couldn't give me any time frame in terms of when we can expect to have one. And I think that's what we need, because if not, we're gonna see a lot of companies, especially in our business, essential services, shut down because the rules are you have to send people home when this happens. So rapid testing to me is I think the number one thing we need to do. And then to Stephen's point, I think we need to get clear around the border, for traveling back and forth. Who is deemed essential services. We have operations in the U.S. that we need to get to from a management perspective, and we're being told, well, they're not essential. And it's like, well, we need to hire people. We need to replace people that aren't coming back. And so all that to say, at the beginning of my comments, I said, I think we need to have better communication between government, health and science, and business leaders, because left on their own, we all make different decisions. Put us in a room together, and I think we can come up with, a good resolution, which hasn't happened yet that I've seen.
Thanks, Bruce. Stephen or Sean, anything that either of you wanted to add to that on the border, or even around issues of testing respective to your organizations?
I think that's a great point, and Bruce had spoken about it in our discussion yesterday, and we put it on the table yesterday afternoon in our executive meeting. And thank you, Bruce, for that, because I think that's something that especially on our driver's side, when they're going into the U.S. for, you know, a 3 to 7 day trip, they're coming back. Those drivers that are hesitant to continue working, which we all know drivers is driver retention is always an issue. If we can offer them a test prior to going back home every time they would do a trip, I think that would put them at a comfort level there where we would be, you know, an employer of choice at that point, and we would be able to retain drivers. And I think it should be the thing to do because, I mean, the drivers are in and out of warehouses, you know, truck stops, et cetera. They could be bringing this home and transferring it to, you know, one of their children, and they bring it to the school, and then it becomes a huge breakout again where, you know, Bruce mentioned one of his employees was, their daughter was infected. We have 2 people on our floor today that are not in because their children had the sniffles. So we weren't sure, so we had them stay home, but we've asked them to get their children tested. And like Bruce said, the testing, you know, we have one here in Montreal. They're open from Tuesday to Thursday and closed the rest of the week. So to me, that's pretty pointless because, you know, you can get this thing 7 days a week. There should be a 7-day, 24-hour testing going on, and rapid testing would definitely help with that. So I think that's a huge problem. And, you know, they get things like, if the government could get things lined up with businesses like ours, the essential services, it would really help.
Ryan, if I just quickly add, you know, one more comment to that. I think I'd mentioned yesterday in one of our conversations about the fact that, you know, Air Canada and the Toronto Airport have launched a pilot over the last couple of weeks where inbound passengers are given the option of testing right away, so a nasal swab, and, you know, and a quick, you know, one thing about this pandemic is I've learned a lot more about you know, pandemics and infections than I'd ever want to know. But you know, there's two elements to the testing. One is, you know, if you've contracted the, you know, the infection in the first 24 hours, it basically just harbors in your nasal passage or the back of your throat, and that's where swabbing can pick up the genetic code of it. You know, once your body starts to respond, then you can be picked up through a blood test, which, you know, is the one that they're using largely in the U.S. So, you know, if we're deemed essential services, and we are, and you know, if the government understands that, you know, without product moving, we've got a serious issue, then I think we should be elevated in terms of testing and say, okay, you know, we've already heard when the vaccine comes out, they're going to, you know, give it to people in need first. Well, I think now with rapid testing, we should be, you know, going out and offering 2 essential services. And to me, you know, trucking is healthcare. They've done it, so it's being done in healthcare now, rapid testing. But I just think that's a great model that Air Canada and the airport have done, where, you know, you get tested, you get a result back within, you know, usually 10 to 12 hours, and then you know if you're carrying the virus and you stay home. If not, because essential services aren't quarantined, you just have to what's the term they use for it? Self-isolate with care, and, you know, nobody wants to infect their families or so. Anyway,
Thanks, Bruce. Stephen, was there anything you wanted to add to that in the border?
I'll talk to both the testing and the border. With regards to testing, the province of Ontario worked with the Ontario Trucking Association to introduce a pilot that I think that holds great promise, not just for Ontario truck drivers, but truck drivers across Canada if implemented by other provinces. We have an organization called Driver Check, and Driver Check does drug and alcohol testing, which is mandatory for all north-south truck drivers. What the province of Ontario did is work with Driver Check to introduce COVID-19 testing. So, and what was great about this is that truck drivers, Driver Check services are built around drivers' lifestyle patterns, which means they're on the road a lot, and they just can't leave the office to go for lunch because they're on the road. So what this pilot program did is made available for truck drivers in Ontario at their various locations, at truck stops, and also the opportunity for trucking companies to set up COVID-19 testing sites right in their yards. So some really innovative thinking by the province of Ontario, and we'll see where that goes. With regards to the border, you know, I think CBSA and CBP have done an excellent job in a crisis of making the border work for truck drivers and trucking companies. And quite frankly, I shouldn't just say that, for the customers on the freight on the back. I mean, trucks don't move across the border because they're bored. They're moving because they're moving our economy. You know, the one thing moving forward, I think that CTA will be working with CBSA and CBP isn't necessarily COVID-19 related, although obviously we'll probably have some work there, but to make sure that irritants at the border, especially at this time, aren't introduced or managed. As the other presenters mentioned and everyone on this line, we all have new challenges and issues associated with COVID. What the supply chain doesn't need is irritants that we could reduce and manage. And so there are a couple issues that we'll be working with CBSA on that we think we have some concerns with that aren't directly COVID-19 related, but would introduce irritations into the supply chain during a pandemic. And I think there needs to be some heightened sensitivity around governments with regards to perhaps not issues directly related to COVID, but irritant issues that will exacerbate the problems of the supply chain.
Thanks,
hey, Ryan, I would have
John.
a question for. Oh yeah, I would have a question for Stephen in relation to the provinces working together. How is that working well?
You know, and I think Perrin can talk about this as well. You know, in the last 6 months, you've seen, I think, unprecedented cooperation between the provinces and the federal government. You read about it, and there's a lot of work that people don't read about. You know, it's been a great time to be a Canadian. I think we can look around the world and perhaps look at countries and systems that we wouldn't be so proud to be working in. But I think the feds and the provinces are really working together to try and make things function as best they can.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for that question, Sean. You know, you referenced it, Bruce, on the testing at airports. I think that's something that's going to come up in one of our future roundtable series here on air issues. But, you know, it's a good example of where industry is leading the way, where it's been, as you said, hard to get the government to come around on rapid testing when it comes to the resumption of travel. And Stephen, it was encouraging to hear from you what the Ontario government is doing to try to innovate in this space. And Stephen, your remarks around sort of other irritants takes me to the last question I'll ask before we open it up to some of the audience questions, which is, you know, we've all been reading with great fanfare the messaging from the federal government about their economic recovery plan that they'll start presenting this fall through a speech from the throne and then some sort of fiscal update or budget. You know, I guess I want to wonder for the trucking industry, you know, what are the types of infrastructure investments or regulatory or other policy measures that your organizations, your members, your companies will be looking for? You know, maybe that we may not see in the short term, but over the medium term that your organizations and ours can be pressing the government for to, you know, not only improve the industry's resilience, but obviously driver safety and the overall competitiveness. What are some of the things that we should be looking to the federal government to do and to put on the Minister Garneau and some of his cabinet's colleagues' agenda in the coming months? You know, since you sort of started leading us that way, Steve, why don't I start with you, and then we'll go back through Sean and
Sure. I think if we looked at some big baskets, one, obviously, strategic infrastructure investment that will have a higher return on investment with regards to supply chain. Classic example of that is the 185, which would a small portion of highway connecting Quebec and New Brunswick, which would really open up the supply chain to long combination vehicles from the Port of Halifax to Windsor. And obviously would give a boost to the supply chain. That's one type of example on the infrastructure side. No doubt there's others for all the modes and including trucking. With regards to our number one ask, well, you got a couple here. On the labor side, you may not be seeing it right now, but it's happening. And as the economy heats up, we had a labor shortage prior to COVID-19. We have the oldest population in the truck driving force over the age of 55 compared to any other sector in the economy. And those folks obviously retire every year. And during COVID, there was a spike in retirements in trucking. So we're looking at a labor shortage in trucking prior to COVID-19 and it has been intensified. So our message to Ottawa involves some training dollars, and also in terms of immigration policies. Blue-collar jobs like trucking have had a hard time accessing immigration programs. I think Ottawa needs to look at it. 70% of all market growth, labor market growth, comes from immigration, and trucking right now has very limited access to that. And the last and not least, if you talk to most trucking companies, their biggest fear has to do with a very soft market. And we had a problem prior to COVID with the underground economy, and we referred to it as driver Inc. companies and drivers who abuse labor laws and tax laws to gain market advantage. And we're seeing a growth in that. And so the message to Ottawa during COVID-19 in the transportation sector is we need enforcement on the underground economy in our industry, as those people who follow non-compliance are looking for more and more customers, and non-compliance avoids compliance costs, which translates into bigger market share. And quite frankly, what's happening, guys, is that the compliant trucking industry is starting to lose to the non-compliant industry, and Ottawa plays a role in terms of enforcement.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I was pleased to hear you address some of the skills and labor things. I noticed on Slido there was a couple of questions on that front, so I appreciate you addressing that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity on strategic infrastructure investment to let folks know that the Chamber has really pressed the government to move more of their $180 billion infrastructure funding towards the National Trade Corridors Fund administered by Minister Garneau. I think it's 2% of the overall plan right now. It's massively oversubscribed. It's a real opportunity for the government to inject some activity into the economy, not just for construction jobs today, but as you said, long-term productivity. And we would highly encourage those that haven't reached out to the minister's office on this call to reach out to them and encourage them to press Minister Freeland and others to free up some money in that plan for these types of investments, because they're critically important, as you said, Stephen, too. Why don't we turn to you, Sean, around sort of some of the priorities and ways that the government can boost the industry going forward.
Yeah, well, so Stephen said it very well. One of the, every time we meet a politician here, we speak to anybody in politics, provincial, federal, our biggest issue is really the driver retention programs and promoting new driver programs. I think the immigration laws make it difficult, and filling trucks is not always the easiest. If you look over my shoulder, we have about 6 or 7 of them sitting right now. They should have drivers in them by the next couple of weeks. But there's always that turnover. People, like Stephen's saying, people not following the rules. Offering drivers, we've heard gift cards for bonus miles, etc., that are not declared. I mean, when you're at a smaller scale than a company like Energy, or companies with hundreds and thousands of trucks, you can't do these types of things. So it's a huge concern, and I think if they did throw some dollars at that, we could get some well-qualified drivers from around the world, and we could build a great driver program, because as the drivers retire, it will become a huge problem, and we're guesstimating in the next 5 to 8 years it'll worsen every single year over year. So we're very concerned about that.
Great, thanks, Sean. And Bruce, turn it over to you if the guys have left anything on the vine for you to pick off regarding some things that the industry might be looking for economic support and recovery.
I think that Stephen and Sean have covered most of it. I guess from a entrepreneurial perspective, we've had to look, because this driver shortage issue, Stephen, it's nothing new. It's been around. We've known this for the last 10 years that we need to deal with. So, in our industry, we've looked for ways, or in our business, we've looked for ways, to be more creative. And, instead of having, we're a little different than your business, Sean. We're more in the service business, so we're moving people's household goods. And for us, we wouldn't run a truck from Toronto to Halifax directly. We'd have, shipment going to Kingston, a shipment going to Ottawa, Montreal. And so that truck would make lots of stops. My point here isn't to boast about how how good we were, but we got creative and said, look, it does not make sense for us to be running trucks half empty across the country or as inefficiently as we were. So we invented this, cool little shipping container that we can actually put on anybody's truck. So, we've managed over the last 5 years to probably shift about 30% of our goods off of our own trucks onto other trucks like Sean's that are running, with the capability to put weight on them. So I think my point is that, maybe the industry itself needs to get a little more creative about how they can, share some of the burden of getting, these across. And then I think, Stephen nails it. We need to trucking is not a business that attracts new drivers like it used to. So whether it's, grants for training, if we're deemed as we are and we've proven an essential service, then maybe there's some grants to encourage people to get into this business and stay in the business, because if not, we're going to have a serious problem. But nothing outside of that to add.
Great, thanks, Bruce. So I'm going to start to turn to some of our questions on Slido. Reminder, if anybody has a question, you go onto the app, which you've seen the address, you would have got it with your registration. You can ask it, or you can vote on other people's questions. The second most voted up question is one on workforce projection and skills. I think we've covered that ground pretty good. The top voted question is pretty broad, but I think it gives all of you a chance to maybe raise some issues that we haven't yet had a chance to touch on. And from Jack about what the top 3 challenges are facing the industry. We've talked a bit about workforce and some other things, so I'm not going to hold you to a top 3, but this is sort of a bit of a chance for each of you to maybe freelance on a couple of other challenges that your companies, your members are facing, either in the present environment or some of these longer term issues that you've been grappling with. So why don't we start with you, Sean, and then we'll cycle back through Bruce and Stephen.
Perfect. Can you hear me? My screen actually just changed to currently unreachable.
Yeah, we can still hear you. Sean.
Okay, perfect. So, aside from, the driver retention, that's always a top 3, filling trucks. For us, the change in the way that freight is moving currently. So we went from, the majority of supply chain moving their goods just in time. And now with the pandemic, obviously, when everything started, the shelves started to get bare. And then the just in time really had to ramp up. But now what we're seeing is the just in case as well. So that's something that we're dealing with. The current volume to be just in time, as well as, the warehousing needs or the contingency plans for the just in case, which we've done well at adjusting. And something we're seeing on the south of the border right now is it's good because tender rejections are essentially up right now. We have all-time high of truckload business in domestic U.S. So energy, 50% of our business is probably domestic U.S. moves. And the volatile rates right now are making it really hard for contractual business. So if you're a contractual company like energy is, we find it right now a little more difficult to hold all of those rates. So we're going back to our clients because, if it's on a 3PL side, a lot of those trucks are now maybe double the price or 30-40% higher. So that's making it a little bit more difficult. On the transactional side, there's huge opportunity because a lot of people are falling off the contract. On the transactional side, a lot of people are falling off of the contractual business. So it's giving opportunity to make back what you're losing or grow. So I really think if you're playing in the U.S. market right now and you have a 3PL division, most people are probably hitting record highs right now. So it's good, but when contractual, it's hard to save face when you're going back every week after week, letting your clients know that the rates have gone up.
Thanks, Sean. Stephen, how about you? Some other challenges to sort of flag for folks?
So I'll say our top 3 challenges are, and I've already mentioned them, so I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record. Number 1, without question, is the issue of non-compliant carriers in our industry getting no attention from enforcement. That goes from the CRA to labor law, to workers' compensation, to lack of insurance coverage, et cetera. And I think the message to Chamber of Commerce members who use trucking services is, remember, ask the question of, are you using these individuals? And the issue, the reason it's our number one issue is compliant carriers are losing market share to these companies. As you heard about the gift card, I mean, that's just it's a really small example, but I'll give you an example, folks. People hire drivers now, and 2 weeks later, when they get their first paycheck, they come into the office and say, what are all these things? When they look at their paycheck, it's just source deductions. Oh, the carriers I worked for before, they don't have source deductions. They just pay me cash. And guys, this isn't by the dozens. This is by the thousands of truck drivers and companies. And we're talking about some of the biggest trucking companies in certain regions are using these models. And they're also using fraudulent insurance. They don't have workers' compensation coverage. So if you're using them and they slip in your yard, it's going to be on you. If they get into a fatal on the highway, they either don't have proper coverage or they have no coverage. This is a big problem, folks. I could take up way too much time, but I'll move on to number 2 with this one. But without question, that is the biggest issue. Oh, and by the way, for those who care about environmental issues and the GHG carbon footprint, a lot of these trucking companies have deleted all their environmental, and there's only in the province of Ontario is there enforcement on this. So we go to number 2, and we talked about it, the labor shortage. You know, you're hearing more companies talk about it. If 2021 gets better, or perhaps more realistically 2022, you're really going to see it. So that issue in itself needs to be addressed. And then the final, I would think, just the big issue is, I would just say the pace of change in terms of labor regulations. There's been a lot of changes for federally regulated employees over the last little while, and that pace of change, not necessarily always the direction, but the pace of change is a challenge for not just the trucking sector, but I think everyone.
Thanks, Stephen. Bruce, what would you like to add on some challenges that AMJ or the sector is facing more broadly?
Yeah, well, I think Stephen touches on what I think one of the number one ones is, which is regulation. Our business is a little different than a lot of the carriers that might be on this call. We're competing against. I hate to say 2 men in a truck, because that's actually a company that's probably reputable, but we're competing against a lot of folks that are going out there and doing exactly what Stephen says. They're operating with vehicles that are not properly insured. They can rent. They're paying cash. And it's a challenge when you're an organization our size that has we have 3,000 employees. We need to make sure we're looking after our employees and making the proper deductions and paying them properly. So to me it's I think stronger regulations. I mean, the government hasn't really sunk their teeth into shutting some of these bad players down, even though they make more press. One of the things, Steve, with our business, we get more in the press when bad things happen than you folks do on the the long hauls. Or shipping goods, but maybe there's also a role in there where we could get industry and government working together, and by that I mean in certain sectors of our business. So take office moving. We're doing office moves for large corporations like banks and blue chip companies. They require that we show them that we're making proper source deductions, that our employees are insured, that we have proper regulations, and Stephen, I think you probably see this as well. Some of the large companies that we're supplying in the transportation industry, they're not requesting this stuff, and they know that it's getting them a cheaper ride. And maybe pressure should be put on them to say, hey, this is not sustainable, because it's not sustainable. We can't compete with those people. So I think that again, that's one of the number ones for me. One of the top challenges facing the industry, I think, is safety. And it's Stephen touches on all of the the influx of and the pace of the information coming, but I don't think we've done enough as an industry to be as safe as we can on the road. I mean, there's more vehicles on the road today than there have ever been, including trucks. And I don't have all the answers, but some of the basic ones are, why don't we have some sort of early warning systems mandatory on all trucks that, I think would help prevent some of when there's a truck and a vehicle accident, it's horrific. Maybe that's something that has to be, regulated. I mean, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, Stephen, just in terms of, what more could we do to, and, by the way, I think a lot of the A players in the industry would adopt that, and that in itself might get some of these bad players out that, that don't want to play by the rules. But truck safety, I mean, whether it's, managing the times that trucks on road with cars, and I'm not blaming trucks, I'm in the industry, but, there's the intermixing of cars and trucks has never been a good thing. So I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts on that, Stephen, because you're closer to it than I am.
So I guess in summary, Bruce, the way I would put it is that I think without question, the vast majority of carriers are always looking at technologies or better management practice is to get safer. I think, and the roads are getting safer. And we're a big advocate of a whole bunch. I didn't even mention third-party ELDs, which is in part will come into force in June of 2021, which is a fantastic measure completely supported by us. And the reason I say it's third-party ELDs is that it's actually certified by a third body, so people can't cheat on these ELDs. So the issue moving forward, though, Bruce, is I think that governments, especially coming out of COVID, are cash-strapped. So why focus on the majority or the top? Focus your enforcement resources on the bottom, and we will clean up, not just from a highway safety perspective, all of this nonsense in the underground economy and the environmental issues, the insurance issues. And I think one of the contributing factors here, I know, is that, and we will start an education campaign this fall as CTA, is the buyers of transportation need to understand they knowingly or unknowingly are supporting these individuals by purchasing their services. We need to be careful because of Competition Act issues. So I'll use an unrelated transportation analogy. Television set costs $1,000 at every major retail store. And you walk out the street and somebody whispers in your ear that I have that same TV in my van for $400. Yeah, it's a good deal, but you darn well know that it's stolen and you're gaining from illegal activity. So if the going transportation price in a certain lane is X, some people out there are at Y, and it's so divergent. Ask yourself the question, how do they do this? Well, I'll tell you how. They avoided all the compliance costs, which makes the difference between X and Y. And so if you're a major corporation and you believe in public safety, you believe in the environment, you believe in a healthcare system, et cetera, you have to ask yourself, am I benefiting by lowering my transportation costs, but not meeting my corporate mandate of my societal commitment to all of these other attributes? And that's something that we would ask everybody in the supply chain to really think about.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I'm looking at the clock. We've got sort of 7 or 8 minutes left, so I'm going to do a short rapid fire here to get through a couple more questions that the audience has asked, and I'll ask maybe just one of you to take on each question, and we'll go through a few here before we wrap up. The top 2 questions on Slido, I think I can kind of lump together. The question is, how will the implementation of electronic logging devices affect the industry? And there's also a second question around sort of future impacts concerning customs and customs clearance more broadly. Does one of you want to take that on for sort of a 60-second answer?
I think that's a good question for Stephen.
Still with us? Sean, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. I think that's a good question for Stephen.
Do you want me to go ahead with this, Ryan?
Just go ahead.
So with regards to the ELDs, in June of 2021, it comes into force. I bet the best way to characterize it is to say nothing has changed other than compliance now moves from a paper-based system to an electronic system. And the only difference between our mandate and the US mandate is the electronic devices that we have, will we be in our trucks, will be third-party certified for anti-tampering. And so what we're going to see, and what we think, what we're very hopeful and excited to see, is a new level of compliance with regards to hours of service. So what that means in the supply chain is, if currently you have a cycle with your carrier of choice where it's tight and perhaps you're not, your unloading or loading isn't perhaps the most efficient, unloading and wait times to unload trucks will become, they should be important today, they will become extremely critical for everyone June of 2021. To be honest with you, Ryan, I think the trucking industry absorbed too much of the responsibility of managing delays upon themselves prior to the ELD regulation. What this is going to do with third-party certified devices is that everyone is going to have to be compliant. So if a customer says, Bob's Trucking can do this, why can't you? Well, everyone is going to have to follow the rules. So if Bob is doing it legally and compliantly, there's not an issue. Bob was skirting the system by running multiple logbooks or the other tricks of the non-compliant trade, well, then Bob is no longer an option. So we're very, very excited about third-party ELDs, not only for its improvement in public safety, but a way to clean up the system. With regards to customs, we have a staff expert on this. The issue that's flagging for us these days, and should flag for all the customers, is one of the systems that we had in place prior to COVID was if there was a problem with paperwork, CBSA had the ability to turn the truck around as opposed to issuing multiple AMPS penalties. That policy's in question, and we have some major concerns about that, as should some shippers and customs brokers. So if you have one big issue, the truck turnaround policy and how we work with CBSA moving forward as it relates to AMPS penalties is a very big issue for us that we'll be talking to CBSA about.
Thanks, Stephen. I have one more question. I just want to give Bruce and Sean a chance, if in sort of a minute or less, they each want to chime in. And there's a question on Slido around sort of long-term trucking trends and some of the impacts. So it's come up a bit today, but some of the last mile delivery issues as a result of e-commerce, and I think the the underground services, as we touched on that a little bit, but also where things are heading with automation, AI, and self-driving vehicles and trucks. I think many of us are aware of the examples in the U.S. between California and Texas on I-10 and some other highways where there's limited pilots of these sorts of things running. But both for you, Bruce and Sean, in just a minute or less, did you want to sort of your eyes to any long-term trends and share any thoughts or comments before we wrap up? Let's start with you, Bruce.
So look, I think both of those are going to be helpful to the future of the trucking industry. AI, I think, is already a lot of us already seen AI in terms of routing, best efficiency for our fleets, and I think that's just going to continue to get better. We're seeing the communication between the customer and ourselves or the suppliers. I think the notion of autonomous trucks. When we talk autonomous, most people think we're talking level 5 where there's no driver in the truck, and I think I think there's 5 levels. I mean, Steve knows better than I, but I think there's 5 levels, if not more, of autonomous trucks. I think we need to get to, a level where, the safety becomes a significant issue. And the, if everything we've talked about today pretty much is about creating a level playing field between us and the bad players and the people that use our services. And so, I think if we had, perhaps, more usage of, controlling the speed of a truck, for example. If everybody has to drive at the same speed, you don't get these bad players that are getting there and getting more turns than we are. And I think the industry realizes that that's the speed at which goods get delivered. Because I think, Steve, we've been sucked in as an industry into believing that when the big box companies want stuff delivered, they control everything from the time it's going to be delivered, and they penalize you, and we don't have a fair playing field. So that's more in a minute. I'll shut up.
Sean, anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, as for automated, automated workflows, energy is huge on that. I think, having a young workforce, we embraced that many years ago, as well as the AI. I had made a comment about autonomous trucks in an article a few years ago, and I agree with the levels of driving and safety is number one. And now with all of the possibilities of, I'll use as an example, ransomware, people can get into your system easily. I mean, we're getting hit in transportation now. Should the security not be to the point where somebody can't overtake one of these autonomous trucks and drive into a schoolyard, I'd be very interested in participating in those, in bringing those units on. But until I know the safety is number one, I mean, I wouldn't put myself in that position. And I think, there's always change, but, the only constant in everything is obviously change, and our industry is changing for the better every day. I really believe that.
I think that's a great remark to wrap up on. For those of you who didn't get a chance to get your questions on Slido, or there was a couple of raised hands as well, if you want to reach directly out to us so we can connect you with some of our speakers, please don't hesitate to do so. I want to thank some members of our team that pulled this together, including Jared Cohen, Rebecca Derry, and Christy Murray, who make all this possible and make this easy and seamless for the rest of us. I want to thank all of our speakers for taking times out of their busy schedule. And just lastly, Perrin, was there anything you wanted to add before we let everybody get on with the rest of their day?
Ryan, thank you. When I introduced today, I mentioned that if our discussions yesterday were any indication, we are in for a treat today. This was an exceptionally fine panel. These folks are very, very well informed, and the content that each of you delivered has been very helpful to all of us. So thank you for your participation, and thank you to all of the people in the audience for their participation today as well. It's been a really good discussion.
Great. Well, thanks again, everybody. We'll end it there just a minute after the top of the hour. We appreciate your time, and until the next in our transportation series, take care.
Thank you.